All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you for supporting us on Patreon. We really appreciate it. We've got a great guest today. I'm happy to welcome him. He's the Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer, and Head of Strategic Advocacy for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Neil Bradley, welcome to the news.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
It is great to talk with you. And I want to start with an issue that I think is on everybody's mind right now. And that's the workforce and jobs. And it seems like there are more job openings than there are workers. What's up?
It seems that way because that's true. In fact, the government, even the government's own data shows that this is the case. Last week we just got the job opening numbers, and what they show, if you compare them to the number of individuals who are unemployed and potentially available to work, is a 1-to-1 match. Of course, we know that's not a perfect match. We know that not everyone is qualified for every job. Not every job is located in the same place where there's someone who is unemployed. And frankly, we know that quite a few of those who are receiving unemployment benefits today are actually turning down work and not taking jobs. And so when you hear employers talk about they can't find workers, that's because they literally can't find workers.
Right. And I mean, I guess the next question is like, why is this? And some people have suggested that it's because of because of the COVID-19, we now have extra money for unemployment insurance. Is that contributing to this?
It absolutely is. It's one of the contributing factors. I want to talk about that in just a second, but I do want to say this is not a new problem. If you rewind to pre-pandemic, January, February of 2020, the number one problem we heard from our members at the U.S. Chamber was similar, had a hard time finding workers. The exit from the pandemic has actually made it worse. And one of the reasons it's actually worse today is the reason you just mentioned, the $300 supplemental benefits. We ran the numbers. We said, how many people are taking home more today in unemployment than they earned working? And it turns out 1 in 4 are taking home more in unemployment than they earned working. So it's not an illogical decision to say, hey, I'm making more money. So we actually we did something interesting. We were researching this back in May, and we said, well, let's go ask people who are unemployed, is this affecting your decision making? And see what they will say. So we surveyed just over 500 individuals who had a job pre-pandemic, lost it during the pandemic, and have yet to return to work. And 16% admitted that they're not anxious to return to work or accept a job because the level of government benefits they're receiving. Then we asked them, by the way, do you think that's true of others who are receiving unemployment? And they said, and 28% said yes, which is the classical way of knowing that that number is probably closer to accurate than the 16% who are willing to admit it about themselves.
And then there's probably some people who were going to be close to retirement anyway. And maybe some people who really just liked being at home and can't fathom going back. And some of them maybe started their own business too. There could be some entrepreneurial positives. Do you see this as a positive, a negative, or a wash?
Overall a negative, but you're exactly right. There's some positive aspects to this too. In our survey, 9% said that they had retired. Now, some of those, if they were approaching retirement age, which some of them would have been, that's a great logical decision. For some who are retiring early, that's unfortunate because the retirement benefits and Social Security, that may not be sufficient to be able to support people. 9% also said that they had started their own business or had begun work as a independent contractor or gig worker. And we actually saw that in the numbers of new business starts, which reached new near-term highs, ironically, during the pandemic. And if those people are starting businesses and creating new jobs themselves, that's good news. Of course, those new jobs that they're going to create are going to need people to fill them, and we're back to the worker shortage again.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a problem, right? There's pent up demand. We want to go places. We want to go to restaurants. We want to go to stores. And there's not enough employees to fill those jobs. And so I guess presumably what happens is the person who owns the store, the restaurant, or the company, whatever, has to pay more money. And that could create some businesses maybe go out of business. They can't afford to do it. I don't know if that would spur inflation, because then they pass along the cost to the consumer in terms of raising the prices of their products that they produce. So how this becomes like almost a cycle, right?
Oh, you're exactly right. And so I think it could spur inflation, and so we all want to see rising wages. Rising wages are a good thing. But when wages are rising because employers are competing with generous government benefits, or when wages are rising because there's been a clamp down on the normal levels of legal immigration, people coming to work either temporarily or permanently to work in the United States, and that's creating a worker shortage. Then what happens is that you either have to pass along those costs, that generates inflation because you haven't gained efficiency, or you can't pass along those costs and you go out of business. Interesting, just anecdotally, I was with my family. We took a little vacation, not at a beach resort, like in the middle of the country, out in Western Maryland, and restaurants who closed at 2 p.m. because they just didn't have the staff to provide service after 2 p.m., or restaurants that were closed for takeout orders because they only had enough staff to staff part of their dining room, and that's all they could manage to cover. That's not good for that business. That restaurant owner is not good for the overall economy.
Definitely. Is this something that the chamber? Well, before I get to that, those unemployment benefits. Am I correct that they'll expire like in September? Is that right? Unless they're renewed.
So, right, under federal law, they've expired the first week of September, unless they're renewed. To date, 26 states have acted using the authority that they're provided with under the law to, after they request the federal government to end it, they end within 30 days. Although, interestingly, we're now seeing lawsuits all over the country in those 26 states challenging the rescission of those benefits.
Now, I would assume that the chamber representing business and would be advocating for these policy changes here. Are you guys lobbying for this? How are you trying to get the word out to fix this problem?
Yeah, so we launched a whole initiative a couple months ago, America Works, that's focused on kind of all of the aspects that we can identify to try to address in the worker shortage crisis. So one of them is right sizing unemployment benefits, meaning let's bring an end to the $300 supplement. We've encouraged states and governors to end the benefits. We've also encouraged other states, and some states have both ended the benefits and done another thing we've encouraged, which is do one-time return to work bonuses. So, we do know from our own survey work that $1,000 bonus can actually be a pretty big inducement to take a job that is offered to you. And we just know from practical experience that sometimes you do have expenses when you've been unemployed and you're returning to work. Maybe it's you got to put your kids back in childcare, and there's some initial upfront costs there that you're going to need that paycheck to cover, but you can't cover it today. It might be that you need a new wardrobe. It might be commuting expenses that you haven't been enduring. And so, there are reasonable things to do there. We're also calling for changes in immigration that we think can help, and also job skilling. Like the most tragic stories of all are the people who want to work and just don't have skills for the jobs that are open. And, anything that we can do to provide skills training that are tied to jobs that are in people's communities, so that at the end of skills training, they're not out searching for a job again. They know exactly where they're going to go work, and they know that there's a job waiting for them. That's really exciting. And we've seen some states go down that road, and we think that has real promise.
I should have asked this at the beginning, but tell us a little bit about you. How did you come to be at the chamber?
Yeah, long road, but I grew up in Oklahoma, a relatively small town, certainly by East Coast standards, called Sapulpa, outside of Tulsa, named for Chief Sapulpa, whose name wasn't Sapulpa and he wasn't an Indian chief. But other than that, the entire story is accurate. Uh, I came to DC for school, and I started working on Capitol Hill while I was still in college, and spent about 20 years up there. And then about 4 years ago, joined the chamber. I've always just had a passion for these public policy issues, and I grew up working in my dad and my granddad's small business, and so I've seen what entrepreneurs go through, and what it takes to try to run a business. And so I've always been interested in helping on that side, and combining those two loves was just a great opportunity at the chamber.
Tell us, I think there were just recently some Supreme Court decisions that are, being heralded as pro-business. Talk about that.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court term just ended. There were quite a few cases before the Supreme Court that the chamber had an interest in. 13, in fact, 11 of them went the direction that we had hoped they would go. Perhaps if I'd summarize the most important victories, come in two camps. One is several decisions that effectively limited the scope of class action lawsuits. And so one of the most important decisions said that to sue, you actually need to be injured, which we thought was settled kind of constitutional law going back, to the Constitution, where the Supreme Court said we only adjudicate where there is conflict and injury. But some creative trial lawyers had figured out some ways to form classes around people who actually didn't suffer any injury. And that becomes a really hard thing for anyone to litigate against. And, the cost of litigation, the cost of defending yourself against pretty meritless lawsuits, even if you win, is still expensive. And so there were actually two court cases that kind of limited those class actions. And then another one that's just important to us as an association and a believer in the First Amendment rights of advocacy is the ability, the affirmation of a Supreme Court case that dates back to the 1950s involving the NAACP, when the NAACP successfully prevailed in maintaining the confidentiality of their membership list. Because at the time, some states who had some nefarious ideas in mind wanted to, frankly, harass members of the NAACP. We've seen a lot more activism in states harassing people of different associations for different reasons. And this case overturned a California law that would have forced disclosure of organizations or individuals who provide financial support to associations or charities or other organizations.
Right. I wanted to ask you about the PAC community, because so we're having this phenomenon, and it hits me personally because my wife, is a Republican fundraiser, and some of her clients are having a real hard time right now raising money from the PAC community. So these are like corporations, many of whom are members of the Chamber of Commerce, and they are not giving money right now to Republicans. A lot of them aren't. Because of what happened on January 6th and certification and all that. Unfortunately, it seems like this is hitting Republicans, even the ones who weren't involved in the January 6th, uproar or certification. And I fear that there could be like unintended consequences here. You could have a scenario where Republicans maybe don't win and some Democrats win who are not as pro-business as the Republican would have been. Or you could have other scenarios where if Republicans can't raise money from the PAC community, they'll say, okay, let me become Marjorie Taylor Greene and just raise money from like Twitter. And either of those scenarios, I think, would be not good for America. Anyway, that's a long wind up. What is up, and is this going to end?
I hope it ends. It should end. let's step back and talk a little bit about what's going on here, because it's one of those things that sometimes things are not as they appear, as they used to say. And part of this is being driven by organizations and activists whose ultimate goal is to eliminate businesses from supporting elected officials, and instead to rely on public financing for campaigns. And it's not surprising that there's bills, that one that passed the House, one that Senator Schumer wants to vote on in the Senate, that would have public financing of congressional campaigns. And they want to use union dollars for political purposes and make sure that business can't play. And so there's been this targeting of businesses to curtail PAC giving or their support for political candidates. And they're using, what happened on January 6th, which was outrageous, inappropriate, needs to be condemned, and people need to be held responsible, as a way of saying, well, you can't support any Republicans. At the chamber, we've taken the position that there are some Republicans and there's some members of Congress, actually, on both sides of the aisle, but some specific to January 6th, who by their actions mean that they should forfeit the business community's support. But just because they voted a particular way on the question that was put to them on certification doesn't mean that they should lose that support, irrespective of how they voted. If all they did was cast a vote on the question that was put forth to them, and that instead we ought to apply a standard that gets at some of the behavior that you just talked about, the people who are trying to blow things up on Twitter, to further divide our nation, to inflame these conspiracy theories. That's where we ought to be focused, not painting with such a broad brush that we have the unintended consequences that you just described.
Do you guys have you put to paper like a criteria for people that should be excluded versus those who haven't?
We have put together on paper, in fact, on our website, uschamber.com, you can go and you can find a memo that we released that expressed that we would not judge members of Congress solely based on the votes on certification, but we would look to the totality of their actions in and around supporting democratic norms and governing. And one of the reasons we said that is because we suspected that January 6th would not be the end of some really crazy stuff that we might see from elected officials on both sides of the aisle. And we wanted the ability to say, hey, there are some things that are out of bounds. And, it's really tough to write a criteria ahead of time. It's what did the Supreme Court say about pornography? You know it when you see it. I feel like we see some of these things and we know that people are crossing lines. And when they cross lines, there ought to be consequences for that. At the same time, when we see members of Congress on both sides of the aisle working really hard to build up the institution, to figure out how to restore functioning democratic norms, who are trying to work across the aisle to show that Congress can work again, we should reward them. That's the behavior we want to see. And so, we believe that people can redeem themselves, that there is value in providing both carrots and sticks. But frankly, there's just a lot of actors out there that only want to use sticks because I think they have alternative agendas.
Right. So you mentioned sort of activists who are trying to use this moment to actually, change our entire, election system or the financing of it to move to public financing, taxpayer financing. What about though? I think there's a narrative out there, at least, that there's a disconnect between like the business community, like the people who actually work in businesses, versus the people that they like hire to, to run the PACs and to make these decisions. Like, are the people who are making these decisions more susceptible to like the influence of quote unquote woke Twitter and less concerned about the bottom line of the business owner?
I think that's a really great question. And I think there is reason to say that in some instances that may be true, that the initial response was, oh, woke Twitter, or these other activists are causing problems, and to respond to that and not to think through the business consequences and frankly the consequences for democracy of taking these type of actions. That said, I think those are probably the exception rather than the rule. We are beginning to see quite a few companies who are saying, whoa, 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 whoa. We do care about speaking out on democracy and voting and those things, but it's also important that we have a functioning program to engage our First Amendment rights to advocate, and that we think about the best interests of the company, and that it is possible to balance those things, but you can't balance those things if you're simply giving in to the latest demands from whatever external activists whose goals may not be aligned with the company's goals.
Yeah. And that leads us into, of course, the perfunctory question about woke capitalism. I mean, I think there is a sense, certainly on the right and the center right, that you have companies engaging in sort of like virtue signaling. In some cases, they are like attempting to maybe cater to a young demographic. We saw it like with Major League Baseball. Other people say like, no, like this is, corporate responsibility. And if it's something like voting rights, they should be involved. And like, this is a healthy thing. Where does the chamber, do you guys have a stance on this?
Well, so I think like so many of today's debates, they become so polarized that the debate is only occurring at the extremes on both sides and doesn't reflect the reality that's somewhere in between those extremes. I am quite certain that if one is looking for virtue signaling, things like that, you can find examples of that. That doesn't mean that every action a corporation or a business leader takes is virtue signaling. There's not a good business reason for it. And, I think what we ought to be looking towards is, are companies being authentic in the positions that they're taking? Are they tying them to the company's fundamental values? Are they tying them to, the strategic place that the company plays, or what they view as their responsibility, particularly in a community that they operate in? As conservatives, we talk about businesses doing good in local communities for civic reasons. I mean, even the Milton Friedman, who the class of maximizing shareholder returns, recognized that in some instances, businesses may want to engage in the communities in which they operate because it strengthens the company and the business. And that in and of itself can generate shareholder returns. And so I think we have to be more careful about how we apply these labels. It's not going to be true that every corporation taking a position is virtue signaling and woke. It's not going to also be true that every corporation who's taking a position is not doing that. And so I just think we ought to be a little bit more responsible in how folks talk about those issues.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's something about the authenticity of it. Like, what bothers me is when I get the sense that this is like really shameless pandering and that it's not authentic. And for some reason that kind of irks me. Because I think it allows one side of the political aisle to kind of manipulate the business community into doing things that I think really could have an impact, as opposed to it being organic. And I'm not sure why that distinction matters so much to me, but
I think it should matter, right? Because that's how you begin to. Because otherwise, you're responding to whims. You're not responding to thoughtful consideration about interests and positions. You're just responding to the loudest voice. I will say, I think we see it on both sides. I hear people saying, well, this such and such company is pledged to do this with respect to climate change. Oh, well, that's woke. Most of the time, what I've seen there is businesses making business decisions about what they think the future looks like and how they want to invest for the future. And maybe they're wrong about that. Maybe the future won't look that way, but that's what businesses do all the time. And the market responds. And if you're right, the market's going to reward you. And if you're wrong, the market's going to punish you. But we should accept that businesses can make those legitimate positions on climate for business related reasons and not just say, because we disagree, it must be because they're woke or virtue signaling or whatever term people want to apply to it.
Well, I mean, and some of these critiques could or have fairly or not been applied to the chamber recently. The chamber, I don't have to tell you, but for the sake of our listeners and viewers, the chamber, I guess in the last cycle, endorsed more Democrats than normal, and there was some pushback and criticism and an uproar about this. And I think some people, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was some people charged that this was like the chamber hedging their bets because there was a sense that Democrats were going to perform better than they actually did. Some people said, this is, they're going to help elect Democrats who are going to then turn around and vote against business interests. So it's kind of like what some of the woke capitalism has been accused of. Was that fair? What should we know about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because there's a. Let me talk a little bit of the history. Let me actually give you something that we're just going to release tomorrow. So the history is last year in the last election cycle, the chamber supported 30 House Democrats in their election campaigns. We supported 194 Republicans, and so the balance there is clearly on one side. They all had one thing in common, though. We judged those incumbent members of Congress based on their voting record. And the way we operate the U.S. Chamber is that we announce that there are certain priorities that we have. We're a free trade organization. We believe in trade. We want a competitive tax system. So we wanted tax reform. We support legal immigration. So we want deregulation generally. And so on all of these issues, when a vote comes up in Congress, we say what our position is. And then at the end of each year, we produce a scorecard, and it'll have 12 to 20 votes on them covering different issues that we care about. And if you voted with us, that's a positive. If you voted against our position, that's a negative. And if you get above 70% as an incumbent, then we generally support you in your reelection bid, because we say you've demonstrated voting with the chamber and the business community. So all of those Democrats had achieved that 70% threshold, just like the Democrats, just like the Republicans had. And so we thought that's a fair kind of objective way of doing it. We've also seen, because we've been doing this for almost 50 years now, that sometimes people improve their scores with us over time, meaning they end up voting more with the business community. Sometimes their scores fall off because they end up voting less with the business community. And so actually tomorrow, the chamber will be releasing its scorecard for the last year that encompasses the entire 116th Congress. And what you'll find is that members who supported USMCA got positive points on our scorecard for doing so, for supporting pandemic.
Tell us, USMCA was?
The U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. So the updating of NAFTA that was negotiated during the Trump administration. Some members lost support because they supported things like a bill called the PRO Act, which would just radically rewrite union policy in the United States. It would also make it essentially illegal to work as an independent contractor in most industries. It would take away the secret ballot elections to form a union. Literally, the union could come to your door because they can get the information from your employer about where you live and say, don't you want to sign this card to join the union? That's not a free and fair election, but this is what that bill would do. And quite a few Democrats voted for it, and so they reduced their support with the chamber because we opposed that bill. The bottom line takeaway from what we'll release tomorrow is that quite a few of those Democrats who we supported are right now on the bubble of that 70%. If they support things like infrastructure going forward, that'll inure to their benefit. But if they vote for the tax increases that the president's proposed, they're going to fall below that 70% and they're going to lose the chamber's support. So we're constantly evaluating members. We always have priorities being voted on in Congress. We want to earn their support. I hope they will support it, but there are consequences for them when they vote against the interests of free enterprise in the business community.
Interesting. Maybe you heard it here first, folks.
Yeah.
There's going to be a new
tomorrow.
scorecard.
It'll all be on our website tomorrow. Check out.
Let me ask you this. I mean,
how they did.
Yeah. What's the website?
uschamber.com, or just go to the Google machine and US Chamber, how they voted. And you can pull up an individual report card for your member of Congress and your 2 senators, and you'll see where they were with us on our priorities and where they were against us. And you can see how they compare to their colleagues too. That's always fun.
So Donald Trump was more like populist than normal Reagan Republicans, right? And so, he was in favor of things like tariffs. He was against like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, which I think would have actually been a great trade deal and a pretty effective way of isolating China, by the way. But anyway, Trump was against that. How much of what happened in the last cycle was the result of Republicans moving away from like the traditional free market fiscal conservative brand that they had for decades?
Yeah. Not a lot of it showed up in the votes, but you're exactly right that it showed up in some of the issues. So, on the positive, tax reform, we finally made our tax code competitive after having, gone several decades with the most uncompetitive tax code in the industrialized world. That's great. The deregulatory efforts undertaken by the Trump administration were very important to kind of unlocking capital and innovation. And we continue to see the benefits of those deregulatory activities. But on trade, it was very much a mixed bag. USMCA was great, but withdrawing from TPP, which we could use to isolate China and form a bloc of Pacific Rim nations, huge missed opportunity. And the rest of the world moved on without us. If you look at the tariffs that were imposed, I mean, you got to go back to Smoot-Hawley days to find that level. Smoot-Hawley in the 1930s that preceded the Great Depression to find the level of kind of tariffs that we had. Some members of Congress pushed back on those tariffs. They tended to do better on our scorecard because they were willing to push back, and quite a few didn't, and that was disappointing. Something that we have to work on.
So if I want to do good on your scorecard, support the infrastructure, bipartisan infrastructure bill, and what do I need to avoid doing for the next year and a half or whatever?
I'll give you the big ones. So
okay.
The tax increases that have been proposed, we're talking about a 1/3 increase in the tax on businesses, including 1.4 million. They say it's all about big businesses. Hits 1.4 million small businesses, that corporate tax increase. The tax on capital gains would hit 2/3 of investment. That's investment that goes in to build infrastructure and to start new companies and to grow existing companies. Hugely problematic. So you got to vote no on those things. There's another one that's coming up that hasn't gotten enough attention. It's called the FAIR Act. Don't you love how Congress names bills? It's like everything is motherhood and apple pie. What it really does is overturns a century of U.S. law that says if you and I are working together, we have a business relationship, and we decide in our contract, in our business relationship, that if we have a dispute, we just want to go to arbitration. We don't want to hire a bunch of lawyers. We'll go to an arbiter. They're professional arbiters. We'll resolve our dispute that way. It says you can't do that anymore. You've been allowed to do that for 100 years. You can't do that anymore. You don't have to guess. You don't need many guesses to guess who's supporting that. The trial lawyers who want all of us to buy their services rather than figuring out how to resolve disputes ourselves. And so that would be a really bad vote for these members to take.
What a racket. I've taken a lot of your time here, almost up against the wall. But before I let you go, anything that I should have asked that I didn't, anything you want to plug or anything we should have talked about?
Well, we talked about some of the bad things. I want to talk about some good news stories. We mentioned this very briefly when we were talking about the worker shortage. The reason at the Chamber we love free enterprise is because of the dynamism. Like, there are folks all over this country who see a problem and go, hey, I think I can build a solution to that. And I bet people will want to buy my solution. And I can, fix whatever that problem is. And one of the great tragedies of really the last decade spans both administrations. So this is not a Republican or a Democrat problem. It's a societal problem, is that we just saw a lot fewer people willing to take risks, to start a new business, to create, to go out on their own. And if we ever lose that in America, we're going to lose that ingenuity and that dynamism that has made us the world leader in technology, the world leading economy that allows us to create things like the internet and lead in podcasts and do all this wonderful stuff. And no one could really explain what was going on. There were lots of different theories. And more importantly, no one knew exactly what to do to correct it. And if there's a silver lining out of the pandemic, is that something was sparked in a lot of people across this country that said, hey, I think I can go out and start a business. And so we've seen these new record levels of people starting businesses. And they're not starting small shops. They're not starting, it's me and my spouse doing it. They're actually already beginning to hire workers and hire people outside of their family and grow. And if that keeps continuing, that is just such a source for optimism about the future, about our standard of living, about our global leadership. And so I think it's an untold story because no one likes to cover good news stories these days.
Yes.
They don't want to cover bad news stories. But I'm glad you gave me a couple minutes to talk about it today.
Well, no, that's true. If it bleeds, it leads. And we have a negativity bias. And I think that, as horrible as COVID has obviously been and tragic in many cases, there will be silver linings that come out of it. And it is awesome to know. I I knew that there were some people, but this is something that's showing up that you're seeing in the data, that people are being more entrepreneurial and starting businesses. And it sounds like you think it may have shaken something loose where we had started to kind of lose our risk taking, and something was shaken loose there.
I think so. And, I'll just say, at the U.S. Chamber, we're right there in Washington. We're right across from the White House. We have a big building. We do lots of events. Pre-pandemic, we would do on average about 2,000 events a year. And so it could be, 20-person meetings all the way to our biggest events were 500 people, for a big speaker, day long, event and discussion panels. And we used to think, wow, 500 people, that's a big audience, for people tuning in person. We went to virtual, like everyone else during the pandemic, and the exact same event, we could reach 10,000 people around the world who would tune in live to the exact same event. And so as we think about the end of the pandemic, we're never going back to just the way we used to do things, because why talk to 500 people when you can talk to 10,000 people around the globe? And, I think our experience has been replicated for lots of other people, probably lots of people listening today who said, we never thought of doing that, but we just did it for the last 15 months. And there's something new there. That's exciting.
I love it. Thanks for ending on an up note. Tell us one more time how people can see the scorecard and the rankings and all that.
Sure. Go to uschamber.com or just Google U.S. Chamber, how they voted, and see how you remember voting. If you like what they did, send them an email and tell them you like it. If you don't like what they did, call them up and tell them you don't like it. That's the way that's the way elected officials learn. They need to hear from us, and they need to hear from you.
Indeed. All right, everybody, check that out at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Neil Bradley, thank you for coming on the news.
Thank you, Matt. It was a real pleasure.